The following conversation is one that I had with Tobias Mathiasen. He is a dear friend of mine who has been developing startups over the last 20 years across multiple continents. He actually started out as a founder in Sweden, then became a consultant in Ireland, and then a banker in Hong Kong, and then for the last 5 years has been an investor in the Nordics. Toby currently serves as COO at Katalysen Ventures and also co-founded SKB.vc, where he's been tirelessly trying to bridge European and Japanese startup ecosystems. This conversation touched upon many topics of my own interest. What are Japanese VCs supposed to be like in an ecosystem? What are some incentives that we can put into place so that more people would be willing to take risks? What are some fundamental Japanese cultural factors that are hindering this ecosystem from fully developing? What is the spark that will allow this ecosystem to become more robust? And finally, we also touched upon more philosophical topics such as why do we chase prestige when we are navigating our own life paths? Toby is an incredibly introspective, reflective, and action-oriented person, and I have so much respect for what he does. I hope that this conversation will also spark some questions in your head about the norms that we live in this ecosystem and whether or not this is actually how it should be. Once again, thank you so much for tuning in to the Cool People podcast, and I hope you enjoy this conversation. So how
Yeah,
have you been? Just like a general, what's up? Like, what's going on?
I'm good. So on today when we're recording this, is it a secret? It's the 21st of
No,
December.
you go ahead, just say.
And we're 3 days away from Christmas. I'm in Stockholm. Stockholm is a very nice, place to spend Christmas and winter in general. We had a snowstorm last night, so there's still a little bit of snow outside.
Oh.
So I'm feeling good. I think the last year I've been trying really hard to be honest about the sort of, honest towards myself and other people, but also honest about the sort of activities I spend most of my time on, and
Mm,
try to make sure that I spend most of my time doing stuff that I genuinely want to do and from
mm-hmm,
places where I genuinely want to be.
mm-hmm,
And I do think, and then if you're able to do that, which it's a luxury, but
mm-hmm,
it's been that kind of freedom has been the single point I've kind of, tried to optimize my life around for the last
mm-hmm,
10, 20 years. So it's not been salary or status or whatever people are drawn to. For me, it's that
mm-hmm,
freedom. And
mm-hmm,
once you do obtain a little bit of that, you can start combining things and places. For instance, which I'm sure we'll go deeper into,
mm-hmm,
Sweden and Japan. But then you also, when you do that, you become a lot more aware of the unique selling points of different places.
mm-hmm,
And when it comes to Sweden, I do think middle of summer and middle of winter are two good times to be here. So for anyone
mm,
thinking about visiting Stockholm, I'd say this late December or the middle of the summer.
definitely for
How
sure.
are, how are you? I heard you were just a little bit ill, but you're
Yeah.
recovering.
I just wanted to mention here, yes, I've been sick earlier this week. I'm feeling a lot better now. But I will be blowing my nose in the middle of the podcast. My head is fine. It's just my throat. So just telling the audience that the quality of my voice will not reflect the quality of this conversation. It's going to be an awesome conversation. So yeah, looking forward to it. If you
Again,
can,
you sound more cool
oh,
with this
thanks,
deep
thanks.
voice, so it's on theme.
A little bit more badass, a bit more cool. But yeah, I've been looking forward to this conversation. And if you can't tell already from the very short "How are you?" that Toby answered, Toby is a very introspective and very reflective person, and we will definitely get into those thoughts and musings later as well. I want to kind of get into the first question to start us off. So you've had kind of like quite a journey across multiple industries and continents as well, but that journey can, no summary of mine can do it justice. So can you kind of walk us through your journey so far?
Sure. let's see where to start. And again, I mean, journeys, I think humans have this tendency to find patterns.
Mm,
And also when we look back on things, we want to find red threads. So
mm-hmm,
when I share my journey, might appear as if, oh, there was a plan all along. But in reality, I was just trying to make the most of each opportunity.
mm-hmm,
But there has been at least one thing has always been there, and it's something I think is very core to me. And
mm,
I think everyone has some kind of, there's some deep source of motivation or some rather basic. It's almost like it's part of your lizard brain that there's some basic activity that really motivates or drives you. And for some
mm,
people, it might be they might have a slightly stronger, competitive urge.
mm.
For
That's
other
true.
people, they might have a stronger urge to just fit into the group or have desire status somehow or the approval of others. And
Mm-hmm,
for me, I realized that everything I've enjoyed doing when I've not been working, and thus I've tried to build those activities into work, are related to transformation and just building, seeing things change.
mm,
So as a kid, in my spare time, I'd love to build plastic models because I enjoyed
mm,
seeing that before. The before and after were so tangible. Or if you're playing Sim City and you start with an empty map, and then after a few hours of work, you have a flourishing or dying city.
mm-hmm,
I always love to poke around in the garden with my mom because you plant something in the spring, and then a few months later, this muddy patch has transformed into a lush garden. So for me, I do think that transformation has always been there.
mm,
And in high school, I mean, at the time, I didn't really understand why I was doing it. But in high school, me and a friend decided to see if we could build a startup. Um, and this was sort of a combination of, now I realize it's kind of a combination of Etsy and Alibaba. Before either one was really a big thing. So we saw that smartphones were becoming a thing. Billions of people who had never been connected before would all of a sudden be connected to the internet. Also, we thought that shopping had become so boring. Me and my friend were both history geeks, and we're always jealous of people who traveled 100 years ago and could actually discover interesting objects. So we
mm-hmm,
thought there are still interesting objects out there, but they're not connected to the internet yet.
mm-hmm,
So if we could build, some kind of an easy solution for maybe mom and pop shops in developing countries, say that a family business in Afghanistan could all of a sudden upload their
mm,
handmade rugs onto the internet and for the first time ever sell it to strangers far away. We thought that's a great idea. So we
mm-hmm,
built it for a year. We took our meager student savings and we bought some time of a programmer at a nearby uni, and he built a prototype for us. And after about a year, we felt, wow, we have a cool idea. We have a prototype. Now we just need to raise, I don't know, 3 million US dollars, we thought.
mm-hmm.
And
Sorry to
naive.
sorry to interrupt, but at that point, what was like the concept of startups very popular around you? Or is it like was it like a startup and it was intentionally a startup, or was it more just like I want to make some cash as a high school student and that's why, like a hustle?
Uh, it was not cash driven.
Mm,
Uh, Honestly speaking, also at that time, I thought business in general was very cool. Me and my friend would often watch CNN, and you'd see
mm.
these cool people wearing suits, being very busy. And some of those cool people had this weird title, venture capitalist. And we
Oh,
thought, oh, those people are, wow, that's very cool. We'd
yeah.
like to be that world. Um, I think that was, the one of the reasons. Also, at least in Sweden, high school startups are quite popular.
Mm,
You're often encouraged to take some time during high school and try to build something with your friends.
that's so
Um,
cool. What the heck?
and I don't know why, I've often thought about, I'm going to keep this tangent very, very limited, but I've also wondered why Swedes have a rather strong entrepreneurial urge. And sometimes I end up thinking of the Vikings,
Mm,
because Viking means to go on a kind of to get on a boat with strangers, and you're making a financial bet on your team, and then
mm.
you're going somewhere with kind of a business plan, and maybe it's like 50-50 if you die on this journey or you return home very, very rich.
Yeah,
So
it's
it's
a
kind
risk.
of like a startup, Um, and maybe, that's the root of why it's the modern day Viking. For
Mm,
us, startups, it's like going on a Viking journey. Um,
mm,
I don't know, but I tried to make one of those modern day Viking journeys. And
mm,
at the time, we were so disappointed. In hindsight, I'm shocked that out of all these investors we pitched, and again, these were huge American VCs, we were super naive. Two of them got back to us, and both of them said more or less, this is not a bad idea, but we first and foremost invest into experience. So come back to us once you have more experience. And I think this word experience is something we'll come back to later when we talk a little bit more about Japan as well.
mm,
But so at that point, I thought, okay, that's not going to work out. But I realized what I should do next. I should get experience. So that I was really annoyed at myself. I
mm,
felt, wow, if we have a good idea, like why it's my fault that we couldn't implement this. If I only had more experience, this idea could have had a chance to fly and prove its value. Um, Mistakenly, I thought these VCs wanted me to have more of that cool wearing a suit, tie, business kind of experience. So I spent the next 4 years studying in Hong Kong, Beijing, and Taiwan, studying mostly finance, business, learning Mandarin because that was the business language at the time.
mm,
Um, just trying to become, the kind of person who could raise money from VCs. And somewhere along that journey, I got lost in this weird Stockholm syndrome whereby a lot of people think it's cool to work to sacrifice yourself for your boss and your employer for this huge organization who probably doesn't care too much about you. It cares a little bit at least. But for some reason, it's cool to really break your back for this entity. And I saw it firsthand with most of my classmates wanting to become investment bankers, consultants. I myself, for a long time there, or at least 2 years, wanted to become an investment banker, a consultant. I did
mm,
related internships, and I realized, wow, day to day, I would hate my life if I had to do that sort of stuff.
mhm,
I need to rethink. And it might be like the first time in my life where I sat down, you kind of reflect on where you're heading. You have enough data in life at that point in time to ask which direction am I heading in? And I realized that, wait a second, the reason I wanted to get experience was because I like building stuff and I wanted to be able to build stuff. Now I'm stuck with a financial degree. How can I use this degree to get closer to building things towards transformation? I thought business and tech, they have a tendency to go rather well together because you often
mhm,
need business for the tech to be sustainable. If I can't be the rocket engineer myself, maybe I can find a way to help rocket engineers with my experience. So then my first job I started was in Ireland, in Dublin, where I joined a small consulting firm that specialized in helping tech companies um, sort of figure out what they're doing right, what they're doing wrong, so that they could then pitch this to investors and raise more money.
mhm,
And this is when I was reminded of, I hadn't thought much about VCs in Hong Kong because it's not a big thing in Hong Kong. But I was reminded of, there are these venture capitalists. They get to be really close to the builders. Maybe they themselves aren't building, but they're close enough that they can probably feel, they can just bask in the energy that surrounds builders. So
mhm,
I thought that might be a good way to combine this financial path I just accidentally ended up on with a
mhm,
much deeper urge. So I worked in Dublin for a year. I spoke to some of these VCs. I got a similar answer as before. You're doing this for a good reason, but you need more experience. I decided to bite that sour apple, go back to Hong Kong. I worked in Hong Kong's financial sector for 2, 3 years. And we mostly helped Western tech companies raise money from Asian investors,
mhm.
oftentimes Chinese investors, mainland Chinese investors.
Yeah.
Um, I felt that these investors were often quite short-sighted. People didn't care so much if these were good companies that were being funded.
Mm,
That did not sit right with me because, again, I cared most about the tech, maybe, and making sure the tech was financed and funded was just an excuse to work with the tech.
Mm-hmm.
So to bring things to kind of a conclusion there, about 5 years ago, I moved to Stockholm and I joined Katalysen Ventures, where I've now been then, which I've been part of for the last 5 years. We're just about to call ourselves something slightly different, but we've been referring to ourselves as a venture developer,
Mm-hmm.
meaning that yes, we invest cash, but we also invest our own expertise, our own experience, and we only invest into cases that need this mix of resources. If all you need is cash, there are other investors who are optimized for that kind of a model. We want to see that you have a challenge that you cannot kind of solve without us,
Mm-hmm.
because that way our impact can be that much greater.
Mm-hmm.
Um, 2 years ago, I was a little missing Asia, you know. I felt that there's, like I mentioned, there's a lot of entrepreneurial know-how in Stockholm. There are a lot of investors here. I felt a little bit replaceable, to be honest. If I wasn't doing this, there are a lot of early stage investors here doing the same or similar thing. I thought, where could I go where there is that same respect for craftsmanship that
Mm-hmm.
I missed when I was in China? Where could I go where my experience would be more valuable? Like if I went to Silicon Valley, I'd be put in the mailroom maybe. Where can I where I'd get more bang for that experience buck? Um, and for some reason, I thought of Japan. And then for the last 2 years, with that as the sort of catalyst, I've been exploring, spending quite a lot of time and effort on trying to find ways to use both my experience in Asia and Europe to see
Mm-hmm.
if we can, to leverage both of these, to leverage my experience helping Nordic entrepreneurs build global startups and companies with global strategies, and to selfishly create an interesting, everyday kind of work environment in life.
Mm-hmm.
Um, and it was through that last experience I met you.
Oh, thank you for providing you're an incredible
Sorry for
story.
the long
No,
introduction.
don't ever say sorry for that. It was a very good story, and I think this is to be very fully transparent here to everyone. This is my second time listening to it, but I was still very enamored with your story. I think, like you said, it wasn't intentional each step to correlate with
Mm.
each other, but you can kind of see like a trend of like who you are as a person and your values kind of trickling through. It did make me think of one question, which is, remember how like in high school and you pitch that idea to the investors and now you're an
Mm.
investor. What do you
Mm.
think about the advice that those VCs gave you as a high schooler? Do you think experience is really important, or like would you have advised the high schooler that you were the same way or differently?
I think so. When I joined Katalysen 5 years ago, I was the idea first, people second person in the team. I thought the most important thing is that we're gunning for and supporting impactful ideas.
Mm,
Like if we're gonna support another shampoo brand, I don't want to do it. The world does not need another shampoo brand. Let's support things that the world actually needs.
mm,
Whereas my colleague, one of my colleagues, he's much more of a people person. He wants to see stubborn people succeed. Idea
mm,
second. Most important for him is that he just want to see that stubborn people, people with grit,
mm,
ultimately end up succeeding because they deserve it. I mean, I've realized you need both, but if I could only pick one or the other, it might be the experience.
mm,
When I look at our portfolio, I mean, it's no secret that the last three, almost 4 years, especially here in Europe, have been really tough.
mm,
First with the pandemic, but then also the war in Ukraine and energy crisis. And it's been like 4 pretty dark years on the startup and investor stage. And
mhm,
when I look at our portfolio, the companies that have the ones, a few failed,
mhm,
they all had, I'd say, destructive, stubborn founders. You
mm,
know, because I like to make a separation. I think in some cultures, people, yeah, it's great to be stubborn, then you're a winner. But I do want to make a separation between destructive stubbornness and constructive stubbornness.
Mm,
You know, if you're constructive stubborn, yeah, you're not going to give up. You have grit, but you're willing to collaborate and sacrifice your own pride in order to not give up. And
mm,
those are the kind of people in the portfolio who have made it through this tough period. The
mm.
ones who were stubborn to accept other people's advice, they've not made it.
Oh.
And I mean, when I look at Japan, one of the reasons I think Japan is so interesting is because it's Japan's startup challenges. It's not related to a lack of ideas. No. Before I started spending time in Japan 2 years ago, I wasn't sure. Are there good ideas? Are
Mm-hmm.
there talented people? Is there experience? You know, there are so many great ideas. There is so much talent, and actually, there is so much hidden passion.
Mm,
Um, it's super interesting a study where they interviewed management students in, I believe, the US, India, and Japan. And they tried to, because, they tried to figure out how passionate are these management students, because the Japanese students might not say it out loud that they have
mm,
this burning fire inside. But when they were asked to answer these questions that are trying to trick out this honest answer,
mm.
actually Japanese management students and American management students were showing similar levels of a desire to make things happen, a
What?
desire for change. But one culture is very vocal about it, and the other one is not.
Mm-hmm.
Um, I'll find the study for you. It's very, very
Yeah.
interesting.
That's
It's not
so
a
interesting. Yeah.
talent or passion problem either. I think the issue is that lack of experience,
Mm-hmm.
because that's going to be a deal breaker when global investors look at Japan. They're going to say you have world class. They're going to say what they told me. You have great ideas, but we first and foremost invest into experience. And as long as you're kind of promoting Japan first strategies, uh, you're not going to get that experience, which is
Mm.
necessary to step in.
And when you say experience, does it mean like actually executing on the ideas, or is it like working at like an American startup, or like what is experience in this case?
I mean, there are different kinds of experience, but
Mm.
when I think I often when I look at a case, I try to simplify things into two factors. One is the idea risk, and the other is the execution risk.
Yeah.
So first, I might think, what's the idea risk? How likely is the idea to be valuable to work out?
Mm.
If there's a check there, how likely are these people to be able to execute on the idea to turn it into something real?
Mm-hmm.
In the case of Japan, because of some of these demographic challenges, I think Japan has no choice but to try to build products that work globally.
Mm.
So I'd be looking and say, hey, do I think this team will be able to build a global company to
Mm.
execute on a global vision? I'm sure they'd be able to do it with a Japanese strategy.
Yeah.
But it's that global experience, really, it's that aspect. And I don't think it matters too much how you get that global experience.
Mm. Mm.
Honestly speaking, if you're I mean, if you were working as an archaeologist in England for 3 years, you'd learn how to deal with. It's more about understanding different cultures,
Mm.
understanding what different cultures are looking for, how different cultures prioritize information. You
Mm-hmm.
see this very commonly when you look at pitch decks in Japan, that the slide order might be the complete opposite of how you present things elsewhere. And
Mm.
that's a very low-hanging fruit, like if you can help a Japanese founder say, hey, if you just swap the order on these slides, you'll
Yeah.
show this American investor that you prioritize the same thing that they are prioritizing.
Mm.
Uh,
Mm. Mm.
sure, it might, if you have some experience from an American startup, that might be even more interesting. But it's really, I
Mm.
think it's the global, that's the key word,
Mm.
not so much which field you're getting that experience from.
I see. I see. So it's kind of like the experience of dealing with customers or listeners or an audience that is outside of Japan. And maybe it's like the malleability and also the knowledge of how they do it as well. And I
Mhm.
guess just being in
And
Japan, it's hard.
Yeah, and it shows again, it's seeing is believing. And if you've spent time abroad, I think investors will go, huh, you're not telling me you want to
Mm,
build a global company because that's what I want to hear.
yeah.
It looks to me, based on your past experience, that you have a genuine interest in
Mm,
building something. So it's also about just from your personal brand kind of storytelling point of view to make it more credible.
mm,
Uh,
mm.
yeah.
For sure, for sure. This is actually a very excellent segue into my next question. So Japan's startup ecosystem is relatively underdeveloped, and contributing to the proportionally fewer startups and unicorns. And many people in the ecosystem often blame this on the VCs, saying that they're mostly like ex-finance people with small investment visions and don't understand what a real startup is supposed to be like. I think what sets you aside from that is despite speaking almost no Japanese and you are also like technically an outsider, you've actually like befriended many of these like super Japanese VCs and spoken to them instead of just talking about them all the time. So I think the big question here is what people say about Japanese VCs true? And if so, why are they like this?
It's a good question. So when I first started visiting Japan, so over the last 2 years, then I think I've been to Japan maybe 12 times.
Mm,
This year, I spent about 60% of my time in Japan, 40% here in Sweden. So the year before, a little bit less time in Japan, a little bit more time in Sweden. But, a fair few times. And whenever I'm there, I'm trying to meet as many people as possible. And I've
mm,
been fortunate to be introduced to a lot of VCs. And I think a lot of VCs have been curious about why I bother to keep coming back. They see, well, one
yeah,
time, but you've been kept coming back. Why? So I've had a lot of these very honest conversations. And at first, I did blame the VCs. I thought that the VCs are not doing their job. I think VCs, their role in the ecosystem is to promote those. VCs should support those 5% of ideas um, that are really innovative. If you look
mm,
at young companies, SME companies, and so on, 95% are building stuff with proven tools, proven infrastructure. But then you have 5% of companies that are developing new tools or new infrastructure, which, if successful, the
mm,
other 95% could use for the greater benefit of the economy.
mm-hmm,
So they're inventing tools for the rest of the economy. But
mm-hmm,
that is a very risky activity. So you need investors that are comfortable taking more risk than banks, for instance, and
mm,
that should be the job of the VC. I so I still don't think most Japanese VCs are fulfilling that role, but I don't think it's really their fault.
mm,
So having going out for drinks and good food with some of these people, I've heard time and time again that actually being a Japanese VC, as long as you've raised your first fund, the first fund is really difficult to raise. But as soon as you've raised that fund, as long as we don't lose the money, probably this LP will support us in our second fund
mm,
and the third fund. If we can double the money, that would come as a great surprise and people would be thrilled. But they also, the reason they invested into us was probably not primarily financial.
mm,
The key reason for investing into us, the key reason that someone wrote on I don't know, the internal investment memo that was looked at by the whole board and everyone said yes to, probably highlighted the strategic reason for investing.
mm, mm-hmm,
I'm guessing it would be some kind of innovation scouting that, hey, this will enhance our innovation scouting functions and people go, yeah, yeah, as long as it doesn't lose money, we're getting the
mm,
innovation scouting for free, kind of. Or it might be an enhanced M&A function. Honestly, I think for a lot of LPs, it's kind of a branding marketing exercise. You
mm,
see a lot of these corporations with a heavy carbon footprint investing into climate tech VCs. I mean, they're probably doing it as part of their green strategy so they can say they're
yeah,
doing something. But the point is that the VCs, the LPs are telling the VCs, hey, if you can climb Mount Fuji, we're kind of happy enough and you can launch your second fund and we'll support that.
Mm,
And then the VCs, their number one priority is to keep their job. So they're going to implement an optimal strategy for reaching the expectations of their LP.
mm,
And if the LP is telling them, you should go for 2x opportunities, the VC is going to implement 2x strategies.
mm,
And I think that's why you're seeing also so many, this IPO craze, or this, from an outside point of view, slightly strange obsession with everything ending up in a Tokyo IPO.
mm,
I think, sure, it's probably partly cultural or just history that it used to be a very attractive thing to do.
mm-hmm,
But I also think it's a exit strategy that you have a lot of influence over. As long as you know the right people, it's more of a timing question. It's a relatively safe exit if you want to reach 2, 3x.
mm,
Um,
mm,
so the LP is saying, hey, climb Mount Fuji, we'll be happy. The VCs are climbing Mount Fuji, just taking enough risk to reach the top of Mount Fuji.
mm,
There is
mm,
no reason to aim for Mount Everest if all you have to do is to show someone that you could get to the top of Mount Fuji. In
mm,
most other countries, I haven't been to most countries, but most countries I've been to, LPs would expect, hey, our expectation is maybe, 5 to 10x. We know you're not going to reach, in most cases, we know you're not going to reach 10x, but
mm.
that's the level of pressure. That's our expectation. Aim for the moon and you might reach the top of Mount Everest.
I
And they
see.
have to take more risk to satisfy their LPs. So I think
Mm,
that's one of the key things that people should talk more about, that
mm,
Japan, the cabinet office, the innovation director should talk about is how can we incentivize Japanese LPs
mm.
to put more pressure on Japanese VCs?
It sounds like there's a huge misunderstanding of what VCs ought to be in society. Like they don't understand, like it's like a very fundamental thing, you know? It's like the definition of a VC in their eyes is just very different, and therefore they don't expect that stuff.
Right. No, I agree with you. And if you look at, I mean, if you look at Japan as a macro perspective, the economy as a whole, one of the challenges, right, is that there's a relatively low return on capital investments.
Mm,
Whenever the industry makes investments into itself, the return is very, very low for a
mm,
developed country. And my guess is, part of the reason is probably because they don't have the latest tools to
mm-hmm,
invest this money into. They're forced to invest into older practices, older solutions,
mm,
because that startup ecosystem or innovation ecosystem, whatever you want to call it, is underperforming. It's not providing Japan's industry with
mm,
new approaches, new tools to revitalize itself on.
mm-hmm.
So if you think of that, then that Japanese VCs, they are looking for a relatively safe way forward. Most Japanese VCs are gonna ask their founders, tell founders, hey, maybe a Japan first strategy. You
Yeah.
know, yes, it's great if you're thinking global, but probably if we have to prioritize, it's Japan first. It
Mm,
means that the founder is going to build the Japanese team with a
mm,
Japanese strategy. And then the founder is not able to raise global money.
mm,
So they have to go back to the Japanese VCs. So it's kind of this self-reinforcing circle, right?
uh-huh.
It's very natural that Japanese founders are listening to investors. Founders do that in all countries.
Yeah.
What would investors like to see? And if all the investors, I've heard this from so many investors, they look at cases and they want to see, oh, I want to see your forecast until Tokyo IPO.
Mm,
It's not, I want to see your forecast. It's, I want to
mm.
see the forecast leading up to the Tokyo IPO.
Mm-mm. So the VCs
Uh,
are kind of setting the goals for them, and the goal is the Tokyo IPO, and they don't see beyond that, right?
no, and if that's what you're telling the founders are also going to think, okay, that has to be my priority.
Yeah,
But the
that's true.
moment that becomes your priority, you've closed the door to foreign investors.
Mm-hmm.
And let's remember, I think last year only 2% of VC money was invested into Japanese startups. So
Mm,
you're closing the door to 98% of VC money. Doing so means that valuations in Japan will probably remain relatively low.
mm,
I do think
mm,
there is a great discrepancy where 95% of Japanese startups are undervalued and 5% are vastly overvalued.
mm-hmm,
Um, but you know, if we could attract more of this global capital, we could raise valuations, which would also make being a founder a slightly more attractive kind of job for
mm.
somewhat risk averse. Maybe Japanese could be founders.
That's true.
Yeah.
That's
I do
true.
think that LP, it's not so much, I think we should talk more about um, how to incentivize LPs to take more
Mm,
risk. There might
mm-hmm,
be certain, very straightforward approaches, tax breaks and such that could,
mm,
make it rational for LPs to put more pressure on VCs.
that's true.
There is another issue, which I don't know if, but there is another one somewhat related I often think of,
Mm,
related to company births and deaths.
okay.
Uh, I think the LP is one challenge in Japan. The second one relates to that if you look at the most developed countries, Japan is one of the countries where the fewest companies actually die. And in an economy that's not growing that fast,
Mm,
it's more or less a zero-sum game, right? So if
mm,
nothing is dying, there are limited resources for new things to be born.
that's true.
Um, I sometimes call this startup compost, and you could see this very clearly in Finland when Nokia went bankrupt. I don't remember how long ago, quite some time
Mm-hmm,
ago now. But after Nokia, this great innovative oak tree fell over,
mm,
a year later, you're seeing thousands of startups from former Nokia engineers.
mm, mm,
Even today, when you look at the Finnish startup, it's like a 50-50 chance that one of the founders is former Nokia engineer.
mm,
When it's very natural for a healthy ecosystem. Things have to die before new things can be born. So yes,
mm-hmm.
we need to talk about LPs, but we also need to talk about how can we make it possible for some of these inefficient,
Yeah.
great trees to fall down and sort of refertilize the soil with
Mm-hmm.
capital, engineering talent,
Yeah.
just feeling a bit stressed. Oh shit, I need to make some money. If I can't find a job, I have to create my own company.
Mm-hmm.
I think
Mm-hmm.
that's also one of these great big discussions that we
Definitely.
have. The last one, because then I always think of these three,
Sorry,
relates more to management
just to
practice.
sorry, just to interrupt, but the before you go on to the third one, but like the second one, I'm wondering if there's like a fundamental like I mean it's very obvious, but Japanese people they don't like admitting that they failed, right? It's like a very micro thing, but I think it could be
Mhm.
that as well, like to be a CEO of a company that like basically failed when you look at the balance sheets, but they can't come out and say it. So it just
No.
kind of zombies and kind of lingers. Maybe that could be part of it.
I
But
think it could be definitely. So I think something media could do, right? If media would talk much more about failure, normalize failure, because people in all countries are glued to the TVs, right? So
that's
as
true.
long as media actually spoke about it, normalized it, we could call
Mm,
it, successful failure or failing successfully, because now
mm,
you can go on and do something more. I also think, honestly, patriotism could I mean, if people see a greater good, that it's for the greater good of Japan, it's for the long-term good of Japan that I failed two times.
mm.
And you wear the failure like a cape. You feel like a hero. It's like, yes, people are going to judge me at first, but I do it for the sake of my country or
Yeah.
for the sake of my family, whatever it may be. But yes, I agree. I do think it's probably I think it's rooted in a fear of failure.
Mm.
And also, as far as I've understood it, I think the government has outsourced a lot of social responsibilities to actually corporations. So large
Oh.
corporations are expected to provide certain social security benefits and safety
Mm.
nets to their employees. I can't remember. I think this was done systematically in like the 80s or 90s
Mm-hmm.
because maybe it costs for the government. Oh, this is getting costly. Let the industry take care of the employees
Mm,
instead.
mm, mm.
So in order for these oaks to fall down, you'd also probably have to look at what happens when people are unemployed. How can we make it easier for people to be in between jobs, to
That's true.
create more agility in that labor market.
That's
Um,
true.
None of these are not easy things, right? But
Yeah.
it all starts with people talking about it,
I have a
normalizing the.
counterpoint. Sorry, I have a counterpoint. You know how like you said, it might be better to have those programs that allows people to survive in those lingering moments before positions or between startups. Um,
Hmm,
but when you look at the States where there's no universal health care and there's so much like chutzpah, there's so much like hustle culture and they
right.
fend for themselves and then it seems to be working out for them. So I wonder if like providing support in those moments is the right solution. I'm not sure. This is just a out of the blue thought,
Yeah,
but
yeah, yeah. Again, I think you can make, I think there are various combinations of these things that could work. I'm
mm,
just getting that the cultural gap between that American approach,
that's
where you
true.
kind of, it's more of like, oh, if you don't do it yourself, you'll be eaten
Mm,
by the system. That gap might be too big. If you try to do that in Japan, people might just end up paralyzed.
that's
I think if you
true.
did that, even if you did that here in Sweden, you'd need some kind of middle step.
Yeah,
Uh, it's not necessarily a bad kind of, some end goal, but in reality, people might just be shocked.
that's true. That's true. That's fair. Like taking account to the cultural background and the context, for sure.
Mm.
There was one more thing that you were gonna mention before I interrupted. Do you remember?
Oh yeah, no, no, no. Just the last little thing I think is, but it is exactly this thing we mentioned now that um, when you look at, and I know we talked a little bit about this before, but when you look at some of these global competitiveness rankings,
Mm,
like I was looking at one of them just before, um, and you look at Japan, for instance. So this one, the IMD ranking, it
mm,
looks at countries from four different perspectives: economic performance, government efficiency, business efficiency, and infrastructure. And if
mm,
you look at Japan, Japan actually has a pretty good score when it comes to infrastructure and economic performance. Government efficiency is kind of middle of the pack. But when you look
mm,
at business efficiency, and in particular, you zoom in on business efficiency and you look at management practices, Japan is like the second last country in the whole ranking.
I'm not
So I also
surprised.
think, we need to talk about the, LP role and the role of VCs in the ecosystem. We need to talk about the value of things dying so new things can be born. And we need to talk about management practices.
Yeah,
And probably it's this last one that's trickling down to these. It's because of these, I'm guessing, management practices where people are so risk averse, like these group decisions, and people are afraid to take risk in these
yeah,
groups. Because of these practices that LPs don't push their VCs.
mm,
It's because of these practices that what's old and what ought to die is not allowed to die.
mm-hmm.
Um, if there's one thing that one should really make a great push at, it's this topic, but it's maybe also the most tricky one.
I think so. Because
This
it's so
might be the
ingrained. It's so
yeah.
ingrained in business. So my father is a like a salaryman, like in Japan, and he has been for
Mm,
the last 20 plus years. And
mm,
hearing like he's a very hard worker, used to be a stockbroker, has always been in
mm,
finance, worked on Wall Street, but the tasks that he's sometimes assigned with blows my
mm,
mind. Um,
mm,
it's crazy to think that in this day and age where Gen AI also exists, that these
mm,
tasks are done by very like skilled people. Um, and it's purely what you said. It's like this risk averseness, fear of failure, fear of like mistakes, and
mm.
yeah, just it really blows my mind. And I don't have a solution to it, honestly. I don't know how it's gonna change. Um, but yeah, do you have any theories on what could possibly trigger a change, or is it gonna be very gradual by individuals who think differently?
I don't know. I mean, I would guess if one of these great oaks does fall over,
Mm,
that could be a trigger for something.
mm,
Um, it could be a shock at first, but it might be the kind of, I remember speaking to a foreign investor. He was he wanted to also really help the Japanese startup ecosystem. He was half Japanese, half foreign. He said after many years trying that, the only thing that's going to work is some kind of shock treatment.
Mm,
Uh, like these small steps, it's just not going to be enough. There has to be some kind of shock
mm,
treatment aspect to it. One of the big oaks falling over could be such a shock treatment.
yeah.
But
Some people say disaster, like a big earthquake, like a natural disaster could be like a triggering moment.
Could be, could be. But I also think that, I mean, if we to not be just focused, to also look optimistically at some of these challenges, I think this is core to why I think Japan is so interesting. And let me give you an example. I was meeting with a professor from Taiwan,
Mm,
from a university that is very famed for their semiconductor research. And
mm,
actually, a lot of the founders from these largest Taiwanese semiconductor firms, they all graduated from this particular university. So it's like
mm,
the world's semiconductor, uni.
mm-hmm.
And we spoke about the fact that that Taiwan and TSMC is investing in Kyushu and so on. And I asked sort of why? Why do you think, Taiwan wants to collaborate closely with Japan?
Yeah.
And he compared it to Korea and said
Okay.
that from a Taiwanese point of view, Korea is kind of a known quantity. It feels like Korea is trying their very, very best. They're running at 110% of capacity. They're really pushing themselves. And they're doing pretty good. But it's
Mm-hmm.
still, since they're pushing themselves, it's easier to forecast them and predict what will happen to it.
Mm-hmm.
He said, from a Taiwanese point of view, Japan is operating at like 20% of Japan's capacity. So if Japan actually got its stuff together,
Mm,
actually found a way to revitalize itself, Japan could be a way larger competitor to Taiwan long term. And
mm,
that is why Taiwan would much prefer to be a partner, like a business partner to Japan, rather
mm.
than a long-term competitor. Because from Taiwan's point of view, there's just so much more potential in Japan. So the mere
Mm.
fact that things are a little bit dysfunctional today is also a great, I mean, and Japan is still the world's fourth largest economy.
Uh-huh.
Yes, the trend is, it's trending a certain way, but it's still doing, compared to most countries, rather well. And that is with all these challenges holding it back. Um, Another thing holding it back, just kind of gender culture. I think this is improving slowly, but imagine if Japan could get productivity and value out of its female workforce as it is from its male workforce. If culture allowed or made it even easier for women to, work and build companies.
Mm,
I like to say sometimes it feels like Japan is trying to box on the world stage with one hand tied behind its back, right?
mm, mm,
What if you could untie that hand? Imagine what would be possible. So, unlike some countries that are trying their very, very best and are still struggling,
mm.
Japan it's like, it's there is still so much potential, so much to be hopeful for. And
Yeah,
again, it's interesting to think what could be the trigger point.
that's true. That's true.
Because if you look at history again, look at the kind of post-Meiji restoration period when
Mm,
Japan had the right ideas, had the right talent, and had
mm,
the right experience at that point in time. It had those three. Amazing things happened. The golden age. Also
mm,
after the Second World War, you had the ideas, talent, and experience.
mm,
Another golden age. At the moment, there are two, but the experience again, and there's so much experience in Japan, but it has to be the
mm,
relevant experience for this very global chapter.
mm-hmm.
We can develop that. Why wouldn't another golden age be possible?
That's true. That's true. Definitely, for sure. I think that's definitely what I hear among very, very smart like people in the ecosystem in Tokyo that Japan is like full of potential. And a lot of people say that this AI boom is kind of on the brink of triggering that. that golden age that a lot of people talk about. I think it's debatable for sure.
Mm.
But yeah, I think I agree. I think the word potential is used very frequently with Japan. Ken, our mutual friend Ken and I talk about this pretty often. Um, this potential, but it's just like what is it gonna be and when is it gonna come and or how do we make it actually happen? Is a more like action oriented way, but for sure.
Because if you had a whole new slew of AI tools available,
Mm.
if uh, the other 98% of the economy refused to use those tools
Oh,
because of old-fashioned thinking, it's not going to be.
yeah.
I think there are much better tools in Japan. I mean, I think there are already a lot of very interesting tools in Japan. It's just
Mm.
that more for this management practice reasons, they're not being used. So
Mm.
we don't need AI to make optimize things.
Yeah.
But no, but this again, I'm overwhelmingly hopeful and optimistic. So that's why I keep spending so much time in Japan.
Totally understandable. And I think I am kind of on the same page with that for sure.
Mm.
The next question or the next conversation that I'd like to spark, I have a quote. I will read it to you. Maybe you've heard of it, maybe you'll recognize it. Um, So, goal-driven ambition is a trait that I don't identify very much with, and that still has some power over me, tempting me to go out there and build a legacy, to accumulate things that I can pile up at the end of life and say, look at all I achieved, while the entire time worrying would other people consider me a failure if I decide to find happiness in simple processes far away from the world's financial capitals. So, is it possible to transition from goal-driven ambition to process-driven ambition and make it perfectly rational to not obsess over one's legacy? Do you recognize this quote, Toby?
A long quote. I might have written that. I'm sorry.
Yes.
Uh,
This is your writing. This is your quote. And I want to mention to the audience here that Toby is this incredible writer, and it's actually a quote from his blog, Harvesting Ideas. And I really recommend you all read it. It's incredible. And I think you and I probably process the world in a rather similar way through like existential crises sometimes and pondering the meaning of our own lives through occasional flurries of chasing prestige. But could you explain this quote a little bit more? Like, what is
mm,
ambition? What is goal-driven ambition and
mm,
process-driven ambition?
mm. No, I was pondering on this earlier this year. And I actually want to anchor it. There was one thought that led me to this. So for the
Mm,
last, I'm 33. I think for 32 years, I've been looking for a greater meaning to life. Um, I don't know, I do remember one day walking to like elementary school, maybe year six or something, and thinking, hey, I've been walking this same road for 6 years. Is this it? Is this what life is like? Is there some greater meaning to it? And I think I just trusted that eventually a greater meaning will reveal itself, or you'll discover it through your further studies or through work. But I never found some greater meaning. And I felt a little bit stressed about that. And then, if it was earlier this year or late last year, some idea, I just landed at an idea that actually made sense for me. So I thought of life as a circular flight where the departure and arrival airports are the same. So what if you're getting on this flight? It's a 20-hour flight, say. You're getting on this flight in Tokyo. And then once you've taken off, the captain starts speaking and says, welcome on board, ladies and gentlemen. This is a 20-hour flight to Tokyo. You'd go like, what the heck? We just departed from Tokyo. What's the point of this flight? I'm stuck on this meaningless 20-hour flight.
mm,
And I'm not a very spiritual person, so I think most likely life begins and ends in the same place for
mm,
me. I don't think there is such a journey where you begin and end in different places.
mm,
So for me, it kind of makes sense that yeah, it's life. It has the same. You start from Earth and you return to Earth, kind of. But assuming you're stuck on this flight, you have a choice. You can just sit there and be bitter about the fact that there's no meaning to it, Or you can just make the most of those 20 hours, enjoy it, watch a good movie, order in some drinks, whatever. So by not searching for a meaning which one might not find, by accepting that the journey is meaningless, enjoying the ride actually becomes rational. And of course, I've always heard people say, oh, carpe diem, make the most of the day. But it was never rational to me because I felt like I ought to be looking for something greater.
Mm,
But this simple comparison, for me, it just, I can buy into it. I don't feel like I'm fooling myself. I actually believe it. I genuinely believe it. So with that takeaway happening for me about, I don't know, a year ago, that it's actually rational to just try to enjoy the ride, make the most of each day, I felt a conflict emerge related to ambition.
mm,
Um, because at least in my experience, I always felt like ambition is this urge, this feeling that you ought to be doing something more constructive. Like if
mm,
you're watching movies, how you should be reading a book or you should be studying so you can get you can get a better job and or work harder so you can get a greater salary. And again, this part of the quote where you're doing stuff that will help you accumulate things that you can gather up at the end of life and like look at everything I achieved. But that very much goes against just wanting to embrace each day.
mm,
So there I felt the conflict because I did not feel that it's unambitious to just try to enjoy each day.
mm,
Why should it be unambitious to try to make the most of each day? That should be just as ambitious and respectable a choice
mm,
as studying hard or working a job you don't actually like
mm,
because you want to be promoted, whatever it may be. Um, but yeah, so this is something I spent a lot of time pondering on, and I kind of arrived at something I call process-driven ambition.
mm,
So instead of being ambitious about the goal, the destination, which I do think most people are, because it's a lot easier to communicate, reaching a goal.
mm,
I try to be ambitious about the process. As
mhm,
long as I'm doing my best in the process, as long as I'm enjoying more often than not enjoying the process, as long as I'm honest to myself and others about how the process is going,
mm,
I can feel pride. I can take pride in that, and that same kind of ambitious pride, because I think the need for ambition is something very natural. I think it relates to it's one of our human instincts. We
mhm,
mentioned at the beginning of the call, right, that we all have different instincts. We're drawn to different things. Wanting to fit into the group is so natural. You don't want to be kicked out of the tribe. That's probably a million-year-old instinct.
mhm,
Um, Wanting to fit into a tribe, we all have a bit of that. But if I can scratch that same urge by being more mindful, by focusing in on the process, making sure it's a process I enjoy, I'm trying to be good at. And then it's less important. So, what I feel now is if I'm working in the garden, I don't have a garden at the moment, but if I was in the garden and I was really in that moment, doing the best job I could, planting a rose bush
mm,
and really enjoying my time, i.e., fulfilling that goal, that make the most of the day, then I can be just as proud about that activity
mm,
as if I was on the New York Stock Exchange trading or whatever. It doesn't matter, if you're doing something that's cool or that a lot of people think is respectable or look up to.
mm,
Um,
mm.
as long as you're enjoying it and you're doing your best and not hurting other people.
Definitely. I think the point you made about we have these goal-driven ambitions because it's easier to communicate is such a key part of it, and we don't realize how influential surrounding opinions are towards
Mm,
our own lives and our own big decisions that we make, which is ridiculous because in this
yeah.
lifetime you're experiencing life through your own eyes and own
Mhm.
lens, yet we're trying to construct these goals based on other people's values and perceptions of the world. I think you wrote about this in your writing as well, and that gave me goosebumps. I was like, that is so true. Um,
If you're
yeah,
focused on, you'll never be truly present. You'll always be
yeah,
thinking about the future. And I really think if there is one KPI everyone should strive to reach or maximize, it's being mindful, because we're not living in the future or the past. We're living in this second that just passed by, right? And if we're not focused on that moment, we're never actually alive. I really think
yeah,
that's true. If you're always thinking about the future and the past, you're never actually alive. But
yeah, for sure.
what's ambition been for you?
That's a good question, and I think I still wrestle with the definition. Um, I think, I'm a management consultant right now, so I think you can extract some essence of chasing prestige from my career. I worked at big brands for many years in internships, and that's what I was chasing. And to say that every single one of those positions provided me with a sense of satisfaction from reaching it would be a lie. I think oftentimes it felt not enough even after I got the position. Um, and yeah, but I have a counter question to you, which is in terms of process-driven ambition, where the definition is in the moment as long as you're enjoying it and feeling good about yourself for doing it, what would you say about like watching a film or watching YouTube or um, like how does that like actually being lazy and being, productive, where does that sit in all of this?
I think, again, if watching a film is how you can make the most of that meaningless flight in that very moment,
Yeah.
I think you should feel proud that, again, I'm doing the perfect activity with that goal in mind.
Mm,
Uh, then again, there might be something else that you could also be doing that you'd enjoy even more.
yeah.
Feel like the sooner we find rational ways to focus on having a good time today or making most of our week being a really motivating, fun, satisfying time
Mm,
rather than saving all of it for once we've retired, the sooner you find a rational way for focusing on something more near term,
mm,
the better. And we all, like, for me, this approach works. This way of thinking is rational for me. Something else might be rational for you.
mm,
But I do think it has to be rational for most people to do it.
mm,
Otherwise, it will just like spam filter. It won't actually work.
mm, mm,
And I do think most people would live better lives if they thought less about the future and
mm,
the
mm.
past. But
That's true.
the approach itself might differ somewhat.
There's a sort of like trust your own instinct and trust your own ability to achieve greatness that is part of this definition of process-driven ambition, right? It's like you don't need to set a sparkly goal in order to achieve greatness. You just have to enjoy the process and understand that you're capable of such thing, and it will all make sense in hindsight. Kind of, I think, correct me if I'm wrong in understanding it, but
But if you ask yourself, why am I striving for that goal? If it's
mm,
because you're like, oh, because I just love the feeling of chasing that goal, well, then
mm,
keep doing it. If you're enjoying that journey, if at the end of the journey you won't feel like you wasted your 20 hours, go for it. So it's also very, very individual. When I've been hiring people, this is the question I like to dig the deepest into. And it comes down to trying to map the responsibilities we want someone to take with the person who would enjoy those responsibilities most of their day, or sort of matching action and motivation. So like if we're an investor, as an investor or investment company, we attract all kinds of people, but you attract a lot of people who love to compete.
mm,
And when they look at us and they consider other choices, they might be considering like, hey, yeah, if I wasn't applying to you guys, maybe I'd be, I'd want to be a professional football player, or I want to be a lawyer and be the best lawyer in the world, like that. There, when you look at their different options, they all have something competitive, like a
Yeah.
competitive thread. We're attracting people who are looking for the status. It's like, yeah, if I wasn't doing this, I'd want to do investment banking or maybe consulting or something that my friends would look up to and I'd be proud of. And then you have, again, these kind of the gardener mindset, where it's like, hey, yeah, if I wasn't doing this, maybe I'd want to be a gardener or an architect. I don't know. I just want to like the action of building things, getting your hands dirty. And I
Mm.
think when I look at that kind of person, I go, oh, you would enjoy working here uh, maybe 4 to 5 days a week. When I look at the person who's seeking status, yeah, you'd enjoy working here. Those moments when you can talk about your job with your friends, or that
Oh,
moment you get your paycheck or you get your promotion. So
yeah.
maybe 10% of the time. And the competitive person maybe would enjoy it every time there's some competitive element in there.
Mm.
Um, Depending on, I just think the sooner you realize what motivates you and you're honest about it, and you're able to map that against, your kind of daily activities,
Mm-hmm.
the better. I'm sure there are a lot of people out there pretending to be enjoying, their current actions.
For
Uh,
sure.
so this next year, one of my focuses will be brutal self-honesty and brutal honesty to other people.
Mm.
I really think that just like a stock market, the more information, the more even information, the more optimal prices will be reached. So
Mm.
if I'm honest to myself and other people, so you're kind of generously sharing information, meaning that more optimal outcomes can be obtained.
Mm.
And, an optimal outcome, you could call that a natural outcome.
Mm-hmm.
And I think nothing natural could ever be good or evil, right? It's just natural. It's like when a tiger kills its prey, it's
Mm.
not really evil, it's not good, it's not bad, it's just natural. So as long as you've been honest to yourself and others,
Yeah.
whatever follows will most likely just kind of be the natural outcome. And
Mm-hmm.
that's also a way of letting go of worrying,
That's
and feeling
true.
regret, or like, oh no, something, I wish I'd done this instead. Or you can feel some peace in that, yeah, many people would say this was not the best, this was a bad outcome, but it was
Mm.
also the natural outcome. So there's no point in worrying about it.
Yeah,
Um,
for sure. And I think it takes a lot of self-awareness, and I guess the word you used earlier is mindfulness about these misconceptions that we might have about morality surrounding certain things. So maybe a person
mhm.
would think a tiger catching their prey is a bad thing, but it takes awareness of I understand it as a bad thing to be able to be like, wait, let me take a step back, strip it from its moral misconceptions and see it as it is. Um, I think I'll take into that honesty thing this year as well, for sure. You've probably seen
Yeah,
it in your practice as well as a VC, being honest about things and how it's effective, right?
honestly, yeah, because the sooner you're honest with just for instance, the sooner you're honest with your feedback to a founder, yeah, they might have hoped, say they hope you'll invest. The sooner if I know myself, yeah, it's never fun to say no,
Yeah.
but the sooner I know it's gonna be a no, the sooner I tell that person, they will say that's a negative outcome, but it allows them to more quickly find a better alternative.
Mm.
So I mean, the end result will be more optimal.
Mm-hmm.
If I had led that person on and they thought, oh, maybe Tobias will invest, um, that means, there's an opportunity cost in there.
Mm-hmm.
So in reality, I do think over time you reach more optimal outcomes, but also it just feels so good
Mm-hmm.
being honest.
That's true. Instead of like dragging it on.
Yeah, and I mean, again, different cultures, but at least in a Swedish cultural setting, I don't think you have too much to lose being that
Mm-hmm.
honest. One could separate also between this constructive honesty and destructive honesty.
Mm. That's
I
true.
think constructive honesty everyone could benefit from.
Mm-hmm. For sure. This is going into like actual the nitty-gritty of it, but how do you tell a founder that you're not going to invest in them? Do you have like a a format or a structure that you follow or
Mm, honestly speaking, it's for us now it's relatively easy because
mm,
for the last year we've been investing mostly into what we call special situation opportunities. So we're looking for companies with, again, big challenges. They might probably it's not they have a good product, they have clients, but there is some other challenge that means that their potential is being held back.
mm,
So oftentimes when we say no, it's because they don't have such a challenge. So it's quite easy. It's like, hey,
mm,
you guys are too good for us.
mm-hmm.
We're looking for people with more challenges so we can make more of a difference. Um, but
Yeah.
but besides, even if that's not the case, I think all people do appreciate honesty. So
Mm,
um, it just takes a little bit of courage the first few times you're brutally honest, but like the
mm-hmm.
fourth time, it becomes a lot.
Yeah.
And if you focus on the benefits of being honest, like, hey, I really like you. I want you to succeed in your fundraising. We're not going to be able to invest right now. I'm telling you up front so that you have more time to find the right investor for you. So
Mm, mm,
that's also a way to make it so much easier to be honest up front.
definitely.
And unfortunately, I think a lot of investors lead on. I think because it's natural. People hate saying no. People hate disappointing.
Yeah.
Uh, I'm sure there's a lot of that where people are hopeful that I was speaking to these guys and they seemed interested.
Yeah.
Um,
It's like a job
and those,
application. You do an interview and they're like, you have so much potential and yeah.
mm,
I I do think it's pretty a big influencing factor in the inefficiency of Japanese processes.
mm,
This lack of sometimes I do wonder what if everyone in Japan just said what's on their mind? What would the world look like? I think it would look kind of different.
I thought of yesterday. I thought of an interesting study to make because I was having dinner with my parents, and we were served at a restaurant. And of course, they ask, "How's the food?" And at least in Sweden, everyone always just says, "Yeah, it's great, thank you," regardless of if it's actually great or not.
Yeah,
It would be interesting to compare countries and see which countries are people the most honest when they receive their food. Are there countries where people say what they think?
that's true.
And based on that one measuring point, can you
Yeah.
see other patterns in society?
I feel like in
Um,
Taiwan it's very upfront. It's like, oh, 这个很油 or 这个很咸 or I feel like
yeah,
they'd say very like upfront. I don't know.
I think Chinese culture in general,
Yeah.
recognizing that Taiwan has their own take on it and Hong Kong has their own take on it, but in
Mm.
general, people are very upfront. People often, when I studied there and I came back after the summer breaks in Sweden, eating meatballs and stuff,
Uh-huh.
people often, you got so fat, La. It's like, yes, I did.
It's a phrase of endurance and people show their love by saying how plump you've gotten in Taiwan.
Yeah, yeah,
And it's like
yeah.
every visit to my grandma's for sure. But yeah, thank you so much for sharing your thoughts on ambition and everyone be sure to read Harvesting Ideas. It's some pretty good stuff. I'd like to move on to the closing questions. I have three questions here for you.
Mhm.
The first question is, what is a book that you'd recommend?
Quite easy. Uh, there is one, so I've moved quite a lot over the last 10 years. I probably moved 10 times over 10 years. And so you end up with a few core things. It's like the first time you move a lot of stuff, you go, nah, next time, I'm gonna leave most stuff or give away most stuff behind. I got a Kindle so that I always have my library with me. But there is one book I have in physical paper format, and that's Meditations by Marcus Aurelius. So this was written by Marcus Aurelius, the Roman emperor. If you watched Gladiator, he's the old dude at the beginning who is murdered by his son.
Mm-hmm.
Uh, and he wrote it, I think, when he was on a military campaign in Gaul or in Germany,
Mm-hmm.
when he was extending the Roman Empire into Germany. He
Mm-hmm.
wrote this personal diary notebook thing just to debrief, I'm guessing, and not go crazy. And it was never intended to be published. And it's a miracle that these notebooks actually has survived through history. And I just think if an insider, a lot of it's quite a short book, lots of short bullet points where each bullet point is sort of a self-contained reflection. And it's a lot of advice on how to just live life and not worry too much about living life.
Mm-hmm.
And if it worked for a Roman emperor, if it helped a Roman emperor relax, probably it can do some good for us as well.
Mm.
Um,
Like Stoicism comes from that, right?
yeah, so Marcus Aurelius was a student of Stoicism, and I think he's probably considered one of the greats.
Yeah.
Himself had, Stoic teachers who themselves were leaning against Greek philosophy. But I've read a fair few books on Stoicism, and I think Marcus Aurelius, since he distills earlier works, it's a lot easier to consume and understand, and he helps translate it for us.
Mm-hmm.
Uh, no, but really, it's a book I recommend everyone to read. I gave
Mm-hmm.
it to like 2 years ago. I gave it to my parents and my sister for Christmas. I don't think any of them read it, but I felt they worried too much about things. And
Definitely.
so if you're a person that worries, this book can really help you find rational reasons for not worrying. Um,
Mm-hmm.
Again, this word rational is so important.
Definitely, for sure. I think my partner is very into his work, Marcus Aurelius' work, and I think him and his friends, one of my one of his friends has a memento mori tattooed on himself.
Mhm.
I think that's also a concept that kind of aligns with this realm of thought, but for sure, it's very important and very mindful concepts too, for sure. Thank you for sharing. I will link that book in the description below for everyone who is interested.
There should be free versions as well, since it's such
Mm,
old book. Um, it's not like copyright protected anymore. It's in
hmm
the common domain. So there are paid versions and free versions. No
mm,
excuse not.
that's true. Maybe there's like a PDF somewhere that I could link as well. The second question I have for you is what is your favorite area in Tokyo?
Hmm. Okay. In Tokyo. I mean, honestly, it's not Tokyo, but so it's not. Let's see if I get away with this answer. I prefer to hang out in like Yokohama because I think
Eh,
there's an interesting historic vibe. You can kind of what I miss when I'm in Tokyo is proximity to water.
mm,
I get that when I'm in Yokohama because whenever I'm close to water, I feel very free and I feel like I'm connected to the world.
mm,
I also, whenever I'm in Tokyo, almost every weekend, I go hiking down, not in Kamakura, but like between Kamakura and Miura, right? So Miura Peninsula.
hi, hi, hi.
So I always go hiking out there, and I really love the
Oh,
vibe. Uh, Maybe if I like Ginza,
uh-huh.
um, because it has a bit of a nostalgic vibe as well. So I
It
like that
does.
vibe. The first 2 years ago, when I spent my first month in Japan, I stayed in Higashi Ginza. So
Eh,
that's probably, it's just like one of these. It feels after 2 years, it's a bit nostalgic. This is where I first started to interact with Japan.
yeah, definitely. It still has some essence of, it has a lot of essence of like Showa
Yeah,
Japan.
yeah,
Yeah.
yeah. Which is quite charming.
Yeah.
Favorite area.
I do like it. I do like that feeling for sure. And the final question is, what can the audience do for you?
Oh, that's a very good question. So, firstly, just also to wrap up this conversation, I think people in general should talk more about how to incentivize Japanese LPs. I think we should talk more about the benefits of letting things fail. So not
Mm,
focusing on the negatives of failure, but focus on if we weren't doing this, what's the opportunity cost? What could we do
mm,
instead? That's the optimistic way to look at it, right? And then I think we need to talk more about, kind of this, just decision-making culture in
mm,
general. But then a little bit more selfishly, so I've spent a lot of time the last 2 years in Japan. I've more or less split my time between Tokyo and Kansai, because I found that, everyone in Japan is a little bit worried about the aging population. But outside of Tokyo, people also worry about the brain drain to
mm.
Tokyo.
I
That
see.
young, smart people with ideas are moving to Tokyo.
Yep.
So by going to Kansai, I could actually find uh, partners feeling even more urgency. Maybe in Tokyo, it's nice to have more investors. In Kansai, they feel we must have more investors. So
Mm,
I've been able to make a lot of progress there, get a lot of traction, but I've also realized that I can't do this alone. The most realistic way for me to actually help Japanese founders is with good partners in Japan.
mm,
Adding to that, I think it's critical that we start. So again, if 2% of global venture capital went into Japanese startups last year, imagine if we could change that to 3%, 4%. The biggest challenge is that experience gap, global experience gap.
mhm,
I'm willing to contribute my own experience, knowing how global investors think, to help Japanese founders, more Japanese founders and startups raise money from non-Japanese investors. So if you're an early stage investor in Japan, maybe you already have a portfolio and you want someone to bounce ideas with, someone to talk about how can more of our portfolio ventures attract global co-investors.
mm,
I'd love to have those conversations. I'm this Japanese track is something I do out of passion. I'm not doing it to make money.
mm,
So as long as, as long as whoever is listening thinks that, yeah, together we can make things happen, I'd love to have those conversations. And you can just find me on LinkedIn. You can search for Tobias Mathiasen. So that's Mathiasen. Or you can email me at tm@katalysen.com.
I'll be sure to link his
No, but
links.
please do. So this is an open invitation to collaborate. And SKB.vc, as you mentioned, is a platform for this kind of global Japanese collaboration.
Mm,
Um, to wrap that up, the three things I want to contribute towards are, bridging Europe and Japan, redefining investor founder expectations. I think Japanese founders could expect more support from Japanese investors.
mm,
And I think Japanese investors could expect more or should expect more global teams, more global mindsets from their portfolio companies. And lastly, I want to help train the next generation of sort of early stage investors in Japan.
mm.
So if any of this, is a shared interest, I'd love to talk more.
Be sure to reach out to Toby if any of this is interest of you or anything that we mentioned today in the conversation as
Yeah,
well.
gardening, history, philosophy, I all of these things make, my time on this circular flight more
Mhm.
interesting, more enjoyable.
Definitely, for sure. And that's all the questions that I have for you today. So, everyone, be sure to reach out to Toby. And thank you so much for listening to this week's episode of the Cool People Podcast. Bye.
Thank you so much.
Bye
Have a good one.
bye. Thank you.